Emotional maturity is a state that few of us ever truly reach, or at least not for very long. It's not a finish line you cross, but more like a quiet harbor you occasionally find amidst the storms of life. But even if we only visit it briefly, it can be profoundly helpful to have a map of that harbor, to lay out what some of its core ingredients are so that we can have a clear idea of what we might aim for. This isn't about achieving perfection, it's about direction. So, if we were to commit to the journey of growing into the emotionally mature people we aspire to be, this is some of what we would have learned. At its very core, the journey begins with a courageous commitment to self-understanding. We would strive to understand the specific ways in which our childhoods made us, for lack of a better word, a little crazy. Now, crazy isn't a clinical diagnosis here. It's a compassionate term for our unique, often invisible programming. It's the set of automatic reactions, hidden anxieties, and unconscious beliefs that were wired into us long before we had any say in the matter. We would come to accept that so much of who we are, our fears, our desires, our very definition of love is shaped by relatively small, forgotten events that unfolded before we were even 10 years old. With this awareness, a truly wise step would be to find a good therapist. Not because we are broken, but because we are complex, and a therapist is like a skilled guide who can help us read the crumpled, old map of our own past. In that safe space, we would begin to notice the recurring patterns in our behavior. Perhaps we see a lifelong tendency to impress older figures of authority, a desperate need for a nod of approval that echoes a desire to please a demanding parent. Or maybe we recognize the painful pattern of falling in love with distant, emotionally unavailable people, realizing it's a subconscious reenactment of a childhood where love felt conditional or out of reach. We would start to acquire a low-resolution but absolutely essential map of our own neuroses, not as a source of shame, but as a practical tool for navigation. This heightened understanding of our own minds would become our greatest ambition. We would become constantly aware of our own limitations, knowing we can never fully illuminate every dark corner of our psyche. Because of this, we would develop a profound humility. We would be deeply cautious in all our assertions and conclusions. Sorry, perhaps, and maybe will become some of our favorite words. Not because they signal weakness, but because they signal wisdom and acknowledgement that our perspective is just one inherently flawed piece of a much larger puzzle. We would recognize what unfaithful allies our conscious minds are in the project of self-discovery. A small part of us genuinely wants to know ourselves, but a much, much larger part is terrified of what it might find and doesn't want to know in the least. Our ego's prime directive is self-preservation, not self-revelation. It will construct elaborate justifications and comforting narratives to shield us from painful truths. We would be humbled by the sheer strength of our own inclinations toward distraction and denial. We'd also acknowledge the profound influence of the body on the mind. We might be on the verge of existential despair, convinced that life has no meaning, only to realize that our crisis isn't philosophical, but physiological. We're just in urgent need of an orange juice or missed out on an hour of sleep. This is perhaps the ultimate humility, to accept that our grandest thoughts can be held hostage by our simplest needs. This deep humility would naturally lead to a more profound compassion for ourselves. We would realize, with a considerable dose of dark humor, that we are fools. We were idiots yesterday, we are idiots today, and we will be idiots tomorrow. There are just few other options for a human being. This isn't a cynical resignation. It's a liberating acceptance. We would shed the heavy burden of pride and the exhausting need to always be right. We would realize how much we constantly misunderstand, never more so than when we begin to have absolute faith in our own competence and sanity. This acceptance would create a precious space, a little more delay between feeling an impulse and having to act on it. We might feel a surge of anger and, instead of lashing out, simply observe it, let it pass through us without taking control. We could, at times, simply observe a feeling and choose to do nothing at all. This internal shift would fundamentally transform how we interact with the world around us. We could finally bear to truly listen. We would become intimately familiar with that common, ego-driven impulse to interrupt someone's story, to say, "Oh, that reminds me of something that happened to me." We would recognize this not as an attempt to connect, but as an attempt to recenter the conversation on ourselves. The emotionally mature person learns to gently silence that impulse. Instead, they would look warmly into the other person's eyes, lean in, and offer the most generous gift in any conversation. "Tell me more." This sounds so interesting. With this new lens, fewer people would strike us as being either very good or very bad. We would see past the curated highlight reels of their lives and sense the hidden struggle in everyone to simply keep afloat. We'd understand that most people are just a complex mixture of the good-hearted and the egoistic, trying their best with the tools they have. With this perspective, we would have far less of an impulse to judge and stone wrongdoers. We'd respect the art of diplomacy and the quiet importance of politeness, acknowledging the surprisingly simple thought that other people are just as fragile and easily hurt as we are. Consequently, we would learn, sometimes painfully, to use language to give those around us a clear indication of what is at play within us. We would abandon the childish expectation that our loved ones should be mind readers. We wouldn't hold it against them for not understanding things we had never bothered to teach them. To protect our own peace, we would adopt a stance of healthy pessimism. This isn't cynicism, which believes things will be bad. It's a strategic realism that accepts that things are often difficult. We would remind ourselves, perhaps on an hourly basis, that all relationships are riven with moments of pain, all business ventures are inherently maddening, and all families are, in their own unique way, gloriously demented. By expecting friction, we wouldn't feel so persecuted when it arrives. This is just how things universally are. It's just that other people are very careful not to speak about it. We would get less naively hopeful, and therefore, less bitter and less furious. Of course, things are often slightly disastrous. Of course, we have made terrible mistakes. Of course, we have been betrayed. But it would all start to feel eminently and supremely normal. This acceptance would allow us to make peace with our past. We would stop lamenting our so-called wrong turns. Yes, we probably did marry the wrong person, or at least a person far more complex than we imagined. We probably did choose the wrong career, neglect our health, and make 1,000 awful errors bringing up our children. But we would see these mistakes not as failures, but as life's mandatory curriculum. We would be starting to get it right if we lived to be 1,000 years old or could do half a dozen practice runs. But we get only one. We'd realize there is no secret manual on how to live. Everyone, even the people who seem to have it all together, is just making it up as they go along. Finally, rooted in this self-knowledge and acceptance, we would find a quiet but unshakable courage in our own authenticity. We would acknowledge that it's impossible to be friends with or liked by everyone. The frantic attempt to please the world ultimately leads to offending many and, most tragically, being true to no one. We would learn the kindness of a swift and honest no to avoid a long and resentful yes. Public opinion would matter less, because we would have seen enough of the shallowness and reflex moralism of crowds to trust our own internal compass. This is our one life, and we would have the courage to be the oddballs we need to be. We would learn to trust our own boredom as a sacred signal from our soul that something is not for us. Everyone else might declare a book brilliant or a play extraordinary. We would feel free to toss it aside or simply walk out without apology. We would have been through a sufficient number of summers and winters to know, deep in our bones, that all things do pass. The crisis that looks like an insurmountable mountain today will, over the years, be worn down to a pebble in our pocket of memory, but no longer a burden. This is some of what we might think and feel if we ever became those paragons of true intelligence, emotionally mature people. The path to emotional maturity is not a destination we arrive at, but a continuous journey of growth, compassion, and forgiveness, most importantly, for ourselves. It's about choosing day by day to be a little kinder, a little more patient, and a little more honest about the beautiful, complicated mess of being human. It's in this gentle, persistent effort that we find true strength and grace. If these ideas about growth and self-understanding resonate with you, this is the very heart of what we explore in our community. We invite you to subscribe to our channel to continue the conversation and join us on this meaningful journey.